This is Sporting Life.
Welcome along. It's time to talk all things Grand National, and to do that, I'm joined by, I think it's fair to say, two of the most qualified members of the Timeform Sporting Life team. We're going to pick the brains of Jumps editor Dan Barber and senior analyst Phil Turner. I'll come to you first, Phil. I know we've seen a lot of changes over the past 10 to 15 years with the Grand National, but does it still give you the odd tingle, this great race?
Yeah, I guess it does. I mean, I think for most people, it's often the sort of way into sort of horse racing, and wasn't quite that with me. I mean, without getting the violins out, I was a very sickly child and had bad asthma as a kid, and there was very little to watch when you sort of holed up on the sea for ages. Back in North Wales as a little kid, about 15 minutes of kids' TV, half of that in Welsh, and I just started watching the horse racing. As many people will know, my favourite horse was Night Nurse, and he ran in a race on the 1977 Grand National Day at Aintree, the famous dead heat with Monksfield. 40 minutes later, Red Rum won his third Grand National. That's the first Grand National I ever watched. I was actually cheering on a horse called Andy Pandy because that was my favourite TV show for a while. It was revived in the 1970s, and he was 10 lengths clear when falling at Second Beaches. But despite that, I've been hooked on the race ever since. And yeah, I mean, it's still just about my favourite race of the year.
And after that Red Rum, Dan, I think we could almost end the video there. But I'm gonna pitch your good self at around my sort of age and guess that maybe Mr. Frisk or Party Politics might have been some of the early years that lit your national fuse. Am I in the right ballpark?
You are, yeah. On the spread, you'd have copped there. I mean, I'm thinking, I think they're names that I was aware of at the time, still in single figures, Matthew, but I think the first year you back a winner where your parents allow you to have 50p each way on something. And I just had back in those days, it was having a belief from afar, not having a clue really, that Richard Dunwoody was the best jockey. So I just asked my parents, I'll have 50p each way on whatever he's riding. And it was the year that the Freddie Starr-owned David Pipe Train Mini Homer won. And I watched it at my auntie's house with the entire family there on a Saturday afternoon. Was the first one that really piqued my interest. Even in those days, of course, it was the only race I watched. I had little to no interest in the remainder of it. But then another one that always sticks in my mind again was getting back from school early-ish on a Monday when it was restaged and Lord Galeen won it in those really distinctive colours. I was of Stan Clark. I was sort of getting slightly more into it at that age, even though I was still youthful, and being aware of those silks as being quite significant and striking at the time, and the horse himself being such a standout, what a physical specimen he was. So they'd be the two early ones that would definitely be at the top of my shortlist, and of course the national that never was as well. Is that 93, Phil?
93, yes, indeed. Let's not talk about that.
I wasn't testing you there. I knew you'd get it right.
That's it. And Tony Dobbin, was it on Lord Galeen? That was a big one for the north of England, wasn't it? Yeah, I remember that very vividly. And Party Politics actually as well. Was he the one that had he had sort of some sort of strange sort of breathing apparatus in his throat? Is that right, Phil?
Yeah, they always had lots of training issues. I think he failed the vet when they tried to sell him first time, and he was bought before the national, just beforehand. Later in his career, not actually the year he won it, but later in his career, he used to run tubed, which is probably what I needed with all my breathing issues as a kid. So I think when he ran later in his career, he was tube, but he had a whole host of issues, and fair play to the connections to keep him, because he actually ended up having a very long career despite those training problems.
And in the election year as well, of course. Now, I know we're entering a bit of a new era, really, with these 34 runners in the Grand National and a standing start now as well. Maybe we'll come back to that a bit later when we talk about this year's contenders. But just, Dan, very briefly, how does this year's race compare in terms of the quality with the last sort of 5 or 6 years that we've seen, do you think?
Well, obviously there's a reduction of 6, but that's a reduction at the bottom end of the weights rather than the top, of course. So that top end quality shouldn't be down at all. And we've got a horse who's finished placed in a Gold Cup in the lead up to this, which is Phil Wood, whose memory is so much better than mine, would probably be able to remember the last one, but it harks back to an age of, say, a Garrison Savannah or a Rough Quest, who managed to do what Korak Rambler is bidding to do this time around by running so well in the Gold Cup, proving yourself ahead of that handicap mark, which remains static, of course, because you're unable to be reassessed for what you've done at Cheltenham. The weights are out early, and Yeah, he's the class horse in the race, isn't he? It's Gold Cup form coming into a Grand National, and that's a bit like the bellwether for the increased quality in the Grand National in recent years, which has rightly been lauded. Here's Exhibit A in that, a horse who probably in that gap between the likes of Rough Quest and Garrison Savannah just wouldn't have been competitive or even tried a race like this. You'd even be talking about a rare example like Neptune Collonge, who even when he won the National, if I remember rightly, was a good couple of years removed from his peak as a Gold Cup placed horse.
Yeah, definitely. Phil, it is looking like potentially conflated. The current top weight might be rerouted if we get more rain in the week, which looks likely. And maybe Noble Yates, the former winner, of course, will end up as the top weight. Now, I won't be holding your feet to the fire on this one in terms of current thinking, but we have seen your shortlist, Phil, on sportinglife.com earlier in the week. That was predominantly Irish based, am I right in thinking?
Yeah, I don't think I'm being particularly brave by narrowing it down to just Irish runners. Clearly, it's top heavy. Probably 80-90% of the runners are going to be Irish trained. And although Corat Rambler did win last year's race, and that clearly has to be very much respected again, he tops the Timeform ratings for many of the points Dan just featured. In behind him, it was all Irish again, and I think he's probably going to be the lone British one trying to hold the fort against them.
And we do have some form of agreement anyway, Phil, because I know you were quite keen on meeting of the waters on the back of that run in the Ultima handicap chase. Now he's creeping towards a slightly shorter price than I was hoping for, to be honest. He's looking like 10-1. Is he still a better, even if he gets to sort of 7 or 8 come the day, do you think?
I think so. I think a lot will depend on who Mark Walsh picks, of course, because he's got a choice of quite a sort of good few runners from in the JP McManus Silks. And I think were he to pick Meeting of the Waters, I suspect the price will contract even more so. But I mean, look, he's got a P. He's the only horse in the field who's got a Timeform P. If you think back to last year, Corat Rambler was only one of two. When one for Arthur won, he was the only one with a P. It's like you're tending to be looking at horses who are exposed, and clearly he isn't. He's a novice, and that might be a way you're talking about the change of the National. We've had a couple of novice winners in the last sort of 7 or 8 years. You were going back to the late 50s to find the previous novice winner before that. So it is sort of changing in that regard. And if you think there was for a race like the Scottish National, you're often looking for unexposed sort of novices in that. They've always had a good record in that. And I guess that the Aintree National might start to look a bit like that. I just thought the way he shaped at Cheltenham, it was very taking. The way he travelled, I think you need a blend of speed and stamina around Aintree because it's sort of, you often find that a lot of the sort of out-and-out stayers who do well in the winter, they haven't got the tactical speed to sort of hold a position at Aintree. I think that won't be an issue with him. And although he is a novice, he's got a lot of sort of experience from his previous connections. And I just thought, I still don't think we've seen the very best of him. He looked to have running left at the end up the hill. That was a real test of stamina in the Ultima. And I just think he's got a lot going for him. And I'd want him on side. And if you can get a double figure price, all the better.
Yeah, I couldn't be against that at all. He actually be one of those having his first run in the Grand National. Now, I am quite interested in giving Mr. Incredible another chance. I know he's another one who's proven quite popular, obviously, with the ground coming in his favour, seemingly on the back of that run in the Midlands National. Now, Dan, I don't know how many times you've watched last year's race back, but if you go back and watch that now and say this Vanilla is a couple of pounds better off with Corat Rambler, given the race that he ran, and the way that he's been campaigned this time around, do you see that being overturned?
Yeah, I reported on the race for Timeform, so I'd watched it about 40 times by about midnight. Trying to get every detail. Now, yeah, it's a tough one for me that in deciding between the pair because it's very much a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other for me. You mark up Vanillier for how much ground he made, how little racing he's had over marathon trips, and how strongly he saw out the trip on his first crack at a Grand National, but that's counterbalanced by the fact that at the other end of the field, under an unusually positive ride for what we normally expect with Corat Rambler, he almost did everything right. And how much value extra was he, considering that essentially, I mean, you'd have made him a really short price favourite halfway when you saw the position he was in, when you saw how well he was coping with the fences. So it's
Just
credit
quickly
to
on
him.
that, Dan. Quickly on that, on Corat Rambler, it's a standing start this time around. He got a really good start last year and
Mm.
was, like you said, unusually forward. Could you
Yeah.
see him being left a little bit back this time around? Because obviously this season he gets left a little bit at the start. He tends to be last.
Yeah, it would be ill-advised, or even not ill-advised, because it wouldn't be part of the plan. But they don't want to revert into those tactics. Vanillier, even by it was a relatively clean race last season, but you don't really want to be that far back. It's just the physics of it, isn't it? It's hard to sustain at the end of a race where you're that exhausted because of the demands of what's gone before for the previous 4 miles. You don't really want to be finishing with running left through that final 2 furlongs. I mean, you want to have been in the race before then. He did make the fences look really small. I don't have a clue what difference the 6 fewer makes. It's still the biggest field that the vast majority of these will have faced, barring a Grand National in previous renewals. It would be the most they've ever faced. So there's still a lot of runners to negotiate. And I think ordinarily it's too big an ask for horses to come from right out the back unless they're exceptionally well handicapped. And that's an interesting point that Phil sort of alluded to regarding the British versus the Irish. It took a horse in Korat Ramba to thwart the Irish last season, who was off 146, who it turns out was on Timeform figures now £20 better than that based on his run in the Gold Cup. And even at the time he was thrown in because he'd gone up about 10 for winning the Ultimate, seeing off fast or slow, and yet was able to race off the same mark. That's the question this time around. Is he quite well enough handicapped, even following that smart run in the Gold Cup, to think he can fend off a couple of the Irish? But I think if any British trained horse can do it, it's definitely him, because he's just got that X factor to him.
They are 2 big leading players again. Dan, before we go, quickly, an outsider on your radar, maybe, just with this weather around, obviously more rain to come. We could end up being really soft at the weekend, possibly not heavy, but what's on the short list at 25s plus?
Yeah, with those details in mind, actually, Matt, I'd give the mare a chance, Gallia de la Toe. Now she's blown hot and cold this season, and she's been beaten in races where, frankly, Grand National winners really shouldn't be getting beaten, smallish field mares races and stuff, but they have been excuses. And if you condense her form this season down to the one performance where she definitely was on song, it was finishing second in the Classic Chase, first run over a marathon trip, completely proven. In fact, she's at her best on testing ground. And I know there are levels of handicap form, but you can't take it as any sort of negative that giving all that weight to My Silver Lining that day, and the fact that she's held her own from higher marks in 2 of the best and most competitive staying handicap chases on the calendar in 2 subsequent starts of higher ratings. I think that's a good piece of form, and she's still scratching the surface of that stamina. She looks like she'd stay any trip pretty much.
Yeah, I don't mind her at all. My sneaky one as well would be Mac Totty. I don't know if he definitely runs here. Always a chance that they could go for the top of him again with him, given the conditions. Now, Phil, outsider for you?
Outsider for me, I'm a bit like a broken record here. It's probably like Groundhog Day, because if it's the National, I must be sort of flagging up Delta Work having a chance. In truth, I suspect he probably has missed his best chance of winning the race, but he was amongst the favourites last year. He's 33-1 at the minute. I suspect Jack Kennedy might remain loyal to him. If that happens, he'll be a much shorter price. And look, he's got loads of back class. He's down to a sort of what is theoretically a good mark for him. And look, Dan mentioned Mini Homer earlier. It looks like we could get similarly testing conditions. If that's the case, think back to that day in the cross-country chase when he beat Tiger Roll. He'll be staying on to death when others are crying enough. So although, you might be looking for sort of minor honours with him, I still think he's a player. And say 33-1 is an awfully big price for a horse who's won so many Grade 1s down the years.
Well, thanks to both of you. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the whole 3-day meeting at the Randox Grand National Festival. Best of luck if you're listening and watching this and thinking of following any of us in, and we'll see you again soon.
Download the Sporting Life app for the best racing coverage, including live racing blogs, fast results, stable tours, trainer and jockey interviews, expert opinion, and tips.